Okay, thank you everyone very much for joining us today for Cyber Attack, how to prevent and manage a breach in your business. I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying respect to the past, present and emerging traditional custodians and elders of this nation, in particular the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose land our Sydney headquarters is situated on, and the various lands on which those of you are joining us. My name's Paul Wright. I'm a practice leader in LegalVision's commercial team.
And I'm Pieter DeGunst. I'm the Managing Director for Tecala Group.
So here is a bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We'll start quite broad and look at some recent data security trends before getting down into the meat and bones of data governance frameworks and policies. Then we'll step back a little bit and look at legal and risk management and mitigation and the various policy frameworks. And then finally talk about some post-breach actions. So starting off with some data security trends, we can see some of these results from a recent privacy survey by the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. Now this is not a business survey, it's a survey of individuals in the community, but it gives a good indication of the general broad consensus in the community at the moment. And obviously that flows downstream into businesses and regulatory frameworks as well. So we can see 3 in 5 Australians see protection of their personal information as a major concern. We see 3 in 4 Australians believe data breaches are one of the biggest privacy risks they face. And then a really high number of Australians believe data security is either extremely or very important when choosing a product or service. So it's not just that this survey is telling us that it's not just something people can think about when they're online or in the online context. We're really at a point as a society, in a community, in a business community, that cyber security and personal privacy is filtering down to all elements of life. We also have a report, the biannual report from the Commissioner in terms of eligible data breaches, which is just on the next slide here. And we can see that there were approximately 400 notifications over that 6-month period, up 19%. Now, importantly, that information is a little bit choppy, so certainly seeing an upward trend of data breach notifications, but it was down a little bit before the most recent period, and then we've seen the swing back up. Around half of those notifications, so around 200, are cyber security incidents, and the other half consisting of things like inadvertent disclosure and human error and things like that. The big 3, phishing, and there are all various subcategories of phishing. It's getting more and more sophisticated as time goes on. Compromised or stolen credentials with an unknown source, so that's always a little bit concerning when a third of notified data breaches, we don't really know the genesis or how they occurred. And then of course ransomware, rounding out the top 3 there. Over to you, Peter.
So I think if we just jump to the next slide, what I wanted to start talking about is actually your data. I think we'll talk a little bit about how to prevent a cyber breach and of course what occurs in a cyber breach, or what typically occurs in a cyber breach. But I just wanted to make the point, I'm not going to go through this whole framework, don't worry. Before I dive into that, I really want to make the point that we don't feel like enough organisations have a really clear view of where their data resides and where the value of that data lies in their organisation, and therefore some of the risk profile that goes around that. So this is just an example of a data governance framework, but it's a good example for your organisation to be thinking about if you're not already thinking about that. Often a threat actor might make an attack for some sort of commercial gain. Ransomware is obviously a popular example of that, and it's not necessarily tied to your data, but the more sophisticated attacks that occur over a longer period of time do require access to systems and to your eventual data. So it helps you to understand what is basically your threat landscape. In the world today of cloud, your data is no longer in the sort of one spot that it might have been. So the concept of protecting your data is now very, very different. It's carried around on devices, it's carried around on your phones, it's stored in other people's data centers, which is basically what the cloud is. And it's no longer within your office like it perhaps used to be. So that changes the thinking when you start to get to cybersecurity controls and technical things, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I think the first thing, if there's a takeaway from today, hopefully, it is to really get clear on where all of your organisation's data reside, various cloud providers, and thinking about the risk that brings with you. So that's all I really wanted to cover off in there.
Can I just quickly jump in, Peter? Because just on that data point, I mean, one of the takeaways that comes out of recent high-profile data breaches is that in a lot of cases they were holding on to data that they either didn't have the right to hold on to or they didn't have the obligation to hold on to. And so they had this data sitting there without the express right to hold on to it, and certainly no compliance obligation to hold on to it. And it was kind of just sitting there a bit like a ticking time bomb, so that when the security breach did occur, it escalated the severity of it by multiple factors. So that really goes to that knowing your data and that data governance point, and being very clear on what data you're holding within the organisation and where it sits.
Another really common one in that same sphere is people are very protective and understand, of course, where your production copies of your data reside in various platforms. But for lots of reasons, including software development or testing or backups or whatever the case may be, there's multiple copies of that data. And some of those protections against, for example, development systems are nowhere near as robust as production, even though you're taking a copy of the exact same data and moving them to those platforms. So there's a very, very common trap that people fall into. I'm not going to mention names today, but there's a lot of people that are in the press that have had that problem. We'll jump to the next slide. So this is probably a good sort of starting point to start to talk about the cyber side of things and the technical aspects as well. So one of the pieces of advice I would give, and again, where a lot of organisations potentially have a misstep, cyber is on everybody's minds. There's various degrees of budgets and how seriously it's being taken. It's discussed in every boardroom, etc. So I don't think there's any shortage of people thinking about it. I think what tends to occur is people choose their own adventure quite a lot in how they're going to go about cybersecurity controls. And you really don't need to do that. There's a lot of incredibly good frameworks that you can use that will help you. There's a lot of very intelligent people all around the world that have built these frameworks, and they're continuously developed and all these sorts of things. So I think choosing your own view of what you think might be important is probably going to leave you with some gaps. And baselining against a framework is something that we think is very valuable. I don't really have a massively strong opinion on which framework to baseline against right now. I will say, if I talk about common frameworks, particularly in Australia, of course, and again, I'm just going to diffuse a little bit some of the elements that might be relevant to global organisations or health industries or things like that. So I'm just going to park that for a second. If you look at sort of NIST, CIS, and Essential 8, they would probably be the top three that I would say we see organisations use that are common across all industries. So it diffuses a little bit of the standard things like GDPR if you're operating in the EU, or HIPAA if you're in the health industry, for example. So that's important. Essential 8 is a really good one where you're seeing, obviously the Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian government really invest quite heavily in trying to help organisations to be more secure if you're an Australian organisation. So that's probably a really good hint. You can also baseline against multiple. So there's a lot of really good tools to be able to allow you to, once you take that assessment of where your current state is, you can choose to baseline that against NIST, CIS, or Essential 8, for example. So I would strongly suggest, if you're not already aligning to one of those frameworks, I think it's a really, really good idea to help just diffuse personal preference, personal opinion, and potentially some gaps that might exist if you do it yourself. On the next slide, I think I'll just sort of try to talk a little bit about, again, diffusing which model. I've anonymised this on purpose. They all follow the same basic principle. So stages of maturity, and generally speaking, organisations will have differing stages of maturity for various technical controls. You might be very, very strong on network security, for example, but quite weak on end-user device security. And so you need to really understand where your posture is across the whole spectrum, of course, stating the obvious. And I think what I would observe, having not only a model, but common language occurring in a business where that adds value, is you're able to actually sit down together as an executive team, as everyone in the organisation, and know, okay, we are currently at stage 1, whatever that means. and we need to get to stage 2 and to stage 3, and we're going to continuously evolve and mature as an organisation. And I think that's a helpful way to think about cyber. A lot of boards like to hope that you're going to tick the cybersecurity box and that's it forever. That's obviously a fallacy. So I think the concept of cyber maturity and the evolution of stages is a really good concept to make sure when you do baseline that you're thinking and talking that way, I suppose, as an organisation. And on the next slide, again, just to try and sort of, I guess, give a little bit of advice as to a little bit difficult with a group of people in the room. I'm not sure where everyone's up to, but the basic sort of way that we would contemplate to approach this. People get very sophisticated in some arenas and they go and buy very expensive technical controls and fancy toys and tools to protect from cyber. The majority of the time, there are fundamental issues that are causing the problem and causing the breach. So I would suggest start with your basic homework. So as I sort of said, baseline against an established framework, look where your gaps are, so that traditional gap analysis type of exercise, and then think about cyber quite programmatically. It's not a technical problem, not just a technical problem. It's not just the IT guy's fault or problem. It is an organisational-wide piece of work that should be considered that way. And from a governance risk perspective, that's really a very important driver. And then from a cultural perspective, it's really quite important as well, balancing cyber controls with the way you run your organisation and the values that your organisation have and how you have your staff and want people to behave is really quite important. There is always going to be the middle aspect here, so that security uplift in terms of formal engagements around maturity assessments and audits and reviews and penetration tests and vulnerability tests and all these sorts of things. So those are always going to be occurring. One thing I would say we highlight there is security awareness training down the bottom. I think that has a lot of value, and we do see organisations with gaps, and that would be one of the gaps. And I'm just going to look around Paul and say, the last point I'm not going to summarise. All I would sort of get to there is, as I sort of touched on before, a lot of organisations will do a transformational security project and then assume that that's done. That's definitely not the case. So ensuring that you have that ongoing cadence and operational cadence, again at a board level, that it's inspected regularly, the controls, at a technical level that you've got ongoing operational management and things like that, and that it's considered within the organisation as a continuous improvement cycle, then you're on the right track. It is a very evolving landscape. There's a lot of things changing, particularly with the use of artificial intelligence, increasing the frequency and severity of attacks. So the defence systems need to continue to change as well. So if you're not continuously reassessing your position, you will have a problem without question. So yeah, that was what I wanted to cover off there. I think we can move to the next slide. This is by no means exhaustive, but hopefully, again, in the spirit of just making sure you can maybe have a look at some of these and tick off some things that you've already ticked off and maybe question mark some things that you might not have. This would be what we would consider to be some best practices around technical controls. So as I sort of touched on before, most organisations have security programs in place. I don't really know of anyone who doesn't. As I sort of said, you commonly will find people will be very, very strong on, I'll pick on network security again because it's been around for a lot longer. Cloud security has been around for less time from a history perspective, and therefore there's often quite a lot of gaps around that. Things like identity and access management have been a very changing landscape in terms of the technologies that people might use, so therefore the threats that come with that are different. But I think if you look at that, it's really quite important to have a range of technical controls that covers your entire environment. But if I loop that back to the data point, starting with your data will help inform you which of these controls need to be in place, and then ensuring that you've got programmatic elements around compliance and risk and the measurements of those controls, so continuous audits and reviews and assessments is important. And then the other one up the top there that I'd highlight is making sure you've got the appropriate monitoring across the whole stack. That's really your sort of eyes on what is going on in your environment. We see significant examples where you sort of find out quite a lot later around a breach, so it's really quite important. And then also the incident response piece, I think we're going to talk about a little bit later, so I'll hold off on that one. But that would be a good sort of quick checklist. Like I said, by no means exhaustive, but but those are the big buckets that you really want to be confident how mature you are across these controls. On the next slide, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you. So that's a really great discussion of the cybersecurity controls and frameworks and really the on-the-ground meat and bone side of this. Now that obviously exists within a broader legal and compliance and risk framework. So starting with the Privacy Act, we'd all be familiar with it. It's been around for a long time. It's constantly changing. We're due to see some additional amendments this year. It is national legislation, and the driving heart of that piece of legislation is personal information. So we're talking about information about identified persons or reasonably identified persons. And obvious examples are things like their name, address, email address, payment information, so credit card information, but also a subset of that is the more sensitive information like health information. Within the Privacy Act, we have a notifiable breach scheme with respect to personal information. And so it applies in situations where there has been an unauthorised disclosure or access of personal information, where there is a likelihood of serious harm with respect to those affected individuals, and remedial action is unlikely to prevent, remedial action will not prevent that serious harm from occurring. So once you have a data breach, currently under the legislation you have 30 days to conduct an assessment to determine whether it is a notifiable data breach. The changes that we're anticipating to come in this year will shorten that period down from 30 days to 72 hours. So under the reform, we're going to see a much tighter process and a much tighter obligation on companies to get right across that breach and whether or not they have an obligation to notify. There is a process under the current legislation that there is some flexibility if you're not able to determine within that period. So if you're not able to determine within the 30-day period, there is the possibility of an extension of time with the Commission, but you have to document the reasons why. It's not sufficient to simply just take longer because you want to do a better job or because you didn't have resource, and you've got to have really well documented reasons why that's the case. If you do complete that assessment and determine that there is a notifiable data breach, you have to first notify the OAIC. There's a process online like that to do that. It's very streamlined. We always advise you to get some external assistance and advice before you do that, because even though the form is quite simple, you are disclosing information to a regulator and it may have unintended regulatory and litigation consequences as a result. And then following notification of the Commission, then you set about notifying the affected individuals as well. Depending on what your business does, you may have additional reporting obligations beyond the Privacy Act. You can see here that there may be reporting obligations to APRA, to the Cyber Security Centre or to AUSTRAC, again depending on what your business does and the type of data it handles. Outside or more broader than that regulatory framework, you obviously have the commercial framework in which we all exist. And so you may have contractual obligations following a data breach. Lots of modern contracts will actually impose obligations on parties in the event of a data breach. And this is typically not limited to personal information, so it may actually cover a far broader remit than the notifiable data breach scheme under the Privacy Act. And even if it doesn't have those provisions dealing expressly with a security breach, the confidentiality obligations that are pretty stock standard under most agreements and things like NDAs and other commercial arrangements may also be affected. So following that data breach, there's going to be an obligation on you to go through those contracts and make sure you're complying with all of those obligations. And then more broadly, you've obviously got reputational and ethical considerations that transcend those regulatory and commercial drivers. Obviously, it all feeds into one another, but depending on your place in the market and the type of business you engage in, you may want to consider those broader reputational and ethical considerations, irrespective of what the contracts tell you have to do and irrespective of what the regulatory regime requires of you. So just turning to the next slide.
Can I just jump in just to interject there? We're back a slide. Just to interject on a couple of things that Paul just said there. One around the contractual piece. A recent example we've had, which I don't think is common, you can tell me that, is people have obviously debt facilities. A lot of people have debt facilities in their organisation. There's a lot of review clauses that might be in there. We've seen some recent examples where a cyber breach triggers a review clause immediately for your debt facility and could put you in breach of that debt facility. So that's something that I hadn't seen before, so I'm not sure if that's new or it's been around and I just wasn't aware. And the other one would be just going back to the point about the obligation of time to sort of look into a data breach and some practical reality of that. I would say common industry knowledge, I would suggest, is about 48 hours is the critical period. If you go longer than 48 hours before you've really in detail inspected what has been breached and what has happened and perhaps how they got in or what has gone on, you are really limiting your ability to get accurate information. So there's a lot of constraints that tend to exist from a technical perspective. The longer you leave it, the worse it is, and therefore being able to give clear advice to the OAIC, for example, or even assess it internally as to what was breached and what happened becomes a lot more difficult. So I think if it is 72 hours that they're heading towards, I can understand why, I think, in terms of the reality of it.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point in terms of the contract terms. I wouldn't say it's very common to have that level of sophistication, but certainly large counterparties, people that are lending money or that are large contractors, that they will flex their muscle on that term with respect to cyber security and anything they see as a potential risk to their organisation. So certainly not common at the moment, but increasingly common, and in the future, in the near future, I think it will become a standard term of almost all contracts. So within that framework and assessing risks, we talk about what can we do to mitigate that risk from a risk perspective, from a legal perspective, from a governance perspective. So separate to what Pieter is talking about, which is obviously essential and crucial, which is nullifying and mitigating the risk before it occurs. What can we do from a governance perspective structurally within the organisation to further augment some of that risk mitigation? So the first is a privacy policy. Now, for lots of companies, that's required under the Privacy Act. We recommend always that, irrespective of whether or not it's required, it's a good thing to have. It gets companies thinking about how they handle their personal information. It sets them up for growth when they will have to comply with the requirements of the Privacy Act in any event. And it also creates an extra layer of transparency, which is very useful for customers and counterparties. So that's an external-facing document. The other two, the incident response plan and the data breach notification plan, are very much internal documents. So these are not necessarily documents you would publicly share. They are internal resources for risk mitigation and governance. The Information Commissioner has said every business should have an incident response plan. That makes perfect sense to me. When or if a cybersecurity incident occurs, it is going to be chaos, and there's going to be challenges right across the organisation, from the very top, from board and key shareholders, right down through to employees, right down through to customers, right down through to potentially community concerns. Having a plan which acts as a kind of playbook that you've thought about in advance, it's not going to necessarily solve every problem, but it will put in that broad framework so that you don't have to do that research in real time, so that you don't have to go about wondering what is happening. I think it also serves two really important points here. One, it addresses a fundamental and innate risk to the business, and that's its primary and key driver. But also for all of us as individuals who work within that business, or whether as founders or directors or employees, it's a really useful tool for us when we're thrust into those really difficult situations, so that if you get the call from the chairman of the board or the key shareholder or any key stakeholder, you can quickly turn to that plan and list the things that you are doing or that you are going to do, and you can take a lot of comfort by saying that we're following the plan and things are going as they should. Now, the data breach notification plan is kind of a subset of that. The incident response plan is much broader. It's dealing with the full range of the response across the business, from the technical side through to the governance side, through to the legal side. The notification plan is much more geared towards, okay, what and when and how do we have to provide these notifications? And again, it's just an additional layer of comfort. You don't need to do that research. You don't need to try to get in touch with external lawyers for those basic early fundamental questions. Once you have those policies and plans in place, the next step of good business practice is to build that policy awareness across the organisation. So we start by doing this through induction processes, building it into induction manuals, and then on an ongoing basis, building it into training. Keep the training up to date. Keep it interesting is always a good tip too. And always be looking to build further awareness across the business. Finally, the next layer you could look to from a risk perspective, developing your compliance registers across the business, and this is as the business matures and gets larger, and also looking at your contractual obligations in things like contract registers. The next slide, back to you, Peter.
Again, this is really quite a simple representation without wanting to sort of over-communicate. I think just picking up on a couple of things that Paul said then before I sort of step through some of these aspects. A cyber breach is a form of crisis. Anyone who's been through one will attest to that. We've got the battle scars from supporting clients through quite a few. And you learn a lot from each of those. And there's nuances, there are commonalities, which is why I think it's really important those frameworks, going back to that, are utilised, because those frameworks do cover the very, very common breaches. It's very important. But I think an observation I would make is organisations who've been around for quite some time are reasonably mature at dealing with various forms of crisis. They might have crisis plans. A really common one would be BCP. Back in the day, pre-COVID, it was a really big thing if your office was unavailable. Now it's not such a big thing, but there were a lot of organisations that were really well prepared with BCP. If this happens, this is what we are going to do. This is how we're going to communicate to our staff. This is how we're going to communicate to our customers and our stakeholders, the press, if that's required, all of these sort of concepts. If that's me holding it wrong or if it's clicking in and out. But so that sort of basic logic and preparation is what I would advise you to think about in terms of cyber from an incident response plan. So this is not just a technical challenge. Again, if you think about trying to minimise damage from these examples and potentially brand damage and financial damage and a lot of things that Paul were talking about, the way you handle an event, a breach, is critical. Really best practices we're seeing is some very sophisticated breach simulations being run quite regularly by clients, and usually, as much as that's controversial, not informing certain key people that you're going to run a simulation, but make it as real as you can, and it'll show you where your holes are real quick. It'll show you the people running around with their head, like chickens with their heads cut off, or the people who are cool, calm, and collected in a crisis. So I think that's important because it's not just a technical challenge on how you deal with a breach. We've had several client sort of CISOs or technical people talking internally and basically making the assertion, we will be breached. We need the organisation to assume we will be breached, and if we are breached, this is what we're going to do. And I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it. I think, she'll be right, mate, or it's not going to happen to us, probably isn't a good idea. Because we're seeing, as I sort of said before, there's a pretty increased frequency and sophistication of attacks. So I think that's a good way to think about it. I think in terms of what aspects that are really, really important, time is of the essence. So how quickly you can get to some of the technical aspects and some of the audits and logs and things like that you might want either your teams or external parties to support you through is going to be really critical. So that first 48 hours, as I sort of said. Which means you're containing something really, really quite quickly, which allows you to eradicate it much more quickly and recover. So I think there's nothing rocket science to that. If you Google cyber incident response plans, you're going to find thousands of things there. It's got to be personalised for your organisation, of course. So that's really quite important. The other one I would say that is unfortunately quite common, and people seem to continually forget. Once you've had a breach, it's generally pretty visible, depending if it's ransomware, it's very, very visible. Some more minor breaches are not so visible. So those immediate actions are usually taken seriously and done reasonably well. People assume once they've sort of contained that initial breach that the bad guys are out. What is often the case is it's the second and the third one that gets you. Because you think you closed the holes, or you think you got whatever the compromised systems out, but they're actually still in. So we are seeing a bit of apathy with people focusing on that particular thing that's come to the front of their mind and not doing a very, very comprehensive review or rebuild. The other one we're seeing is people who successfully execute a ransomware attack. They're quite aware that your organisation is predisposed to pay them. So they'll go again. So I think if you're not diligent after a breach in whatever lessons you have learnt from that and implementing them and being very diligent about them, you are opening yourself up. We're seeing that becoming, unfortunately, reasonably common. So
that's right, and I mean, and certainly we talk about reputation. I mean, obviously it's very bad to have one cybersecurity incident. It starts multiplying in factors when you have multiple cybersecurity incidents, one follow the other. Customers, clients, the public general become less and less forgiving if there's a multiple series of cybersecurity events. And then just finally on that ransomware point, the Australian government's position is legally you should not be paying paying under ransomware. And their official position, I don't know how much it flows through in practice, is that they will not provide any assistance to you once you pay that ransom. So there's no government or official avenues that you can go to where if you pay a ransom and the other side doesn't fully hold up their end of the bargain, you're not going to get any assistance from the government there either.
On that example of that I made before about simulated breaches, a ransomware attack is a really good one to simulate because it actually tests backup recoveries and a bunch of other things there, which in terms of the confidence to not pay a ransom and just cover your systems quickly is really quite important. One of the best simulations we see. I think that's next.
So just a couple here on post-breach actions, but in the interest of time, so we have plenty of time for questions, I'll just dive straight down to the duties of directors. Now at the moment, there's no express duty that specifically deals with cybersecurity for directors in the Corporations Act. That will likely change at some point in the future. We don't really know the time horizon on that. However, irrespective of that, the head of ASIC has come out very clearly multiple times over the last 18 months and said that the regulator doesn't consider that it needs an express specific director's duty to take regulatory action against directors in relation to cybersecurity. So that's really important for founders, boards, directors, and also those who report to them, that the corporate regulator is very much on the look for breaches of directors' duties, and the most obvious duty is the duty to take reasonable care and diligence. We're seeing that from a number of regulators, that really now we're at the point where cybersecurity is not just something that happens, it's not just something that comes in, there's nothing you can do about it. It needs to be fully integrated into the business, it needs to be fully integrated within risk and compliance and governance systems. And failure to do that and failure to consider that at the board level can have serious regulatory outcomes for the directors as individuals. So that last point, which I think we've just talked on there in the context, obviously the regulatory points, the legal points, the compliance points are all super important, but when you're in business and you have counterparties that you rely on, you have customers, I mean, rebuilding trust is key at the end of the day. A lot of the other regulatory things can be dealt with, can be addressed. It can be very, very difficult to rebuild trust other than through time and a lot of commitment in that space. So that should always be an overarching driver as well. We have one more slide on some questions that I think you put together, Peter. I don't know if you have anything you want to quickly say on these.
Just going to read all. Look, I think the purpose of this, I think we can obviously have this in the slide as a sort of takeaway was really the intention. So all I'll really highlight there is, as I sort of said, they're not technical questions here. This is around governance, risk, compliance. There's some resilience aspects there around cyber, of course, but also cultural elements. So we find these are really, really good questions to be asking internally. It tests things like your risk appetite, so how seriously are you going to take these sorts of things. So it's probably more of a takeaway than something I want to talk about, but yeah, obviously we can answer questions around that as well.
So we are going to go to the floor and online for any questions. Just to give everyone a little time to have a think about that, a few quick announcements. LegalVision has an upcoming in-person event, AI in Business, Mastering Compliance and Mitigating Risks. That's on Tuesday, the 23rd of April, 11 o'clock in the morning. Please follow the link in the pack that is sent around. A couple of other quick things we'd just like to mention. I'd like to talk about the LegalVision membership, which is quite a unique legal offering. By becoming a LegalVision member, you get access to a team of 100 plus experienced lawyers to assist with all of your business as usual needs. As part of that fixed fee membership cost, you get unlimited document drafting and reviews, unlimited legal advice consultations, and unlimited domestic trademark applications. We have a very broad, deeply experienced team. We work very quickly and with a high level of commerciality. By attending today or joining online, you get a free complimentary legal health check, so please reach out either directly to one of the LegalVision staff afterwards or via the link in your pack. I'll throw it across to you, Peter.
Equally on our front, I suppose, in terms of, hopefully there's been some takeaways there for you to go and action. If that's all a bit overwhelming, we can certainly help. So as I sort of highlighted a few times, that assessment methodology would be the first bit that we would counsel you to start on. So if you need some help around that, effectively there's an offer there for anyone who's attended today. Marcus is hiding up the back, so if you can give a quick wave, but I think Marcus's details are on the next slide to get in touch with him. He heads up our sales team, so reach out to him. We're more than happy to just come and have a chat. There's no obligation to that. We can give you some advice around how we would approach things for your particular organisation, but spoiler alert, it's going to be around making that assessment and some of the baseline assessments, because we do believe that's the right way to do it.
Okay. Oh, I just lost the microphone. So time for questions. If anyone here in the audience like to raise their hand, we'll get a microphone across.
Gentleman up the back there. The roving microphone coming. Mine is not working, so I don't know. Hopefully you guys heard me.
It's working? Yeah. I'm in financial advice, so my question is more professional services rather than other industries. But in terms of the legal side, the likely privacy changes through Canberra, if they get through this year, how will they affect small businesses, less than 10 staff, not your CBAs of the world? What do we think that a small business with up to a couple of million of revenue, how they might be affected?
So I think that in terms of the application, provided the Privacy Act does apply, it will affect I think proportionally, commensurately. I mean, I know that's not a great answer. Certainly the reforms and the legislation itself is targeted and is really geared towards those larger organisations. But certainly if it applies and you suffer a data breach, your organisation or your clients, there is sort of no softening of the requirements there, so there will still be the 72 hours. The Commissioner will still look at it with the same level of interest. So I think, I think we're moving more towards an all-encompassing, an increasingly all-encompassing Privacy Act. I think at a policy level, however, there still is, a lot of interest and target at where the regulatory action and the regulatory effects can be most effective, if I can put it like that. So I would say, look, it's just as important for the small businesses to be across this. It's just as important for them to have all of their plans and policies in place and to be compliant. Speaking more generally, regulators do like to catch the big fish. That's naturally what they're charged with, and I think that's what the community expects. But at the same time, they are not averse to going after any breach wherever it applies. So I think it is a bit of a sliding scale, but compliance is compliance at the end of the day. There are some thresholds built into the Privacy Act so that it only applies at certain levels. But once those levels are met, there is no sort of general sliding scale as to application or safe harbours or anything like that.
The other thing to think about there is I think the director obligations are quite consistent. So regardless of the size of organisation, maybe the quantum of any particular fine might change, but the director obligations and what's coming down the pipe around the personal obligations of a director and being able for ASIC to come after you on that front, I think that's consistent regardless of the size of the organisation. So. Yeah,
absolutely. The director stuff is 100%. And again, to that point that the regulators are absolutely interested in big enforcement action, and that's what the community expects. Those big organisations are heavily resourced, and the directors themselves are personally very well resourced. You see a lot before the courts. A lot of the cases are much smaller businesses that have been unsuccessful or successful, and it's easier to grapple with at an enforcement level in some respects. So absolutely they apply with respect to the director's duties, and sometimes it can be much easier from a regulatory perspective to take enforcement action there.
I think ultimately what they're trying to get to is people to take it seriously. So the concept of, reasonable and appropriate measures or something, I can't remember the language, but what we do is, in a lot of cases, these breaches are preventable, and it is in some cases, not always of course, in some cases there aren't reasonable measures being taken, and there can be budget reasons for that. People are busy, there are competing priorities. I can give you the laundry list of excuses, and we all have challenges in running our businesses, but that's really what they're going after, is for people to take it seriously, and obviously one of the ways that regulators do that is fines and enforcement activity. So I think trying to get to reasonable, a lot of those things that I put earlier on there in terms of common controls, and sort of if you look at, I think even in the OAIC stats that were in there earlier, top five sort of breaches, it gives you the hints on what are the things that you should be really quite focused on. And those controls, as we mature, I suppose, as an industry in the cyberspace, are getting more cost effective, so they're cheaper to implement. They're becoming reasonably standardised in terms of certain technologies. So the challenge, I think, is getting a little bit easier in terms of what you should have as your baseline element. Some of the sophisticated stuff is a different story, but at least getting the baseline fundamentals isn't as hard as it used to be.
Any other questions on the floor?
So on the 72-hour thing, so lots and lots of data breaches you hear about. People have been in your network for 18 months, or people have been pottering around inside your file share for a year or whatever. So that 72 hours is from the time that you discover it. Is that really enough time for, again, I'm from a smallish business. I don't have any IT folk. I have a provider, thank you. I mean, and I've also got a cybersecurity law firm, and I've got a virtual CISO, and I've got all these various different people who all collaborate on trying to keep people out. In 72 hours, I'd probably struggle to get all of them in a room, much less figure out exactly what's happened, exactly who's impacted. It doesn't seem like very long, especially if they've potentially been in my network for a year.
I think, yeah, regardless of how long they might have been in, I think it is a reasonable time frame to hit, to be honest. And I think the incident response plan would tend to govern that. So there are certain contracts around that in terms of incident response parties where it sort of means some things need to be prepared. Of course, you're not having the issue of, okay, let's all now sit and discuss and let's coordinate and now let's take action. So some of the SLAs would be within the first 24 hours, we're going to have done A, B, C, D, E, and F. So that's really what the incident response plan should govern. And so there are ways you can, for relatively low cost again, because it's sort of like a retainer model, you can have agreements in place that says, okay, we're going to mobilise like this, access controls, passwords, and there's certain tactical things that need to happen there. But I do think it is reasonable and realistic.
Yeah, and just to add a couple of things. I mean, there is flexibility built into that notice period. It's not a hard and fast 72 hours. I don't think the Commissioner expects, if you have been conducting the assessment around the clock for 72 hours, and I'm not talking about nullifying the threat, I'm talking about that test about it being an eligible data breach. If you've been working around the clock, the Commission will obviously take that into account. It is not interested in drawing a hard, fast line at 72 hours and punishing regardless. However, if you've done nothing more than hold a couple of high-level meetings, and you're yet to engage external advisors, that's probably going to carry a lot less water with the Commissioner. So I think it is about that best endeavours. They will have regard to the nature and the effect and the reach of the breach. But they will also expect that you may not have fully got to the bottom of it, but if within 72 hours you can see that personal information has been extracted and that it's likely to cause serious harm and there's nothing you can do about it, they probably will expect some form of notification, even if it's not doesn't contain all of the information at that stage.
That's an important point. Yeah, the benchmark for the notifiable breach around personal harm and PII and those sorts of things, it goes back to the data point I made at the beginning. So if you're really buttoned up on what elements of data reside in various systems, and then you are then aware that system A was breached, and hopefully that system doesn't have PII, then that straight away tells you're probably at a reduced risk of a notifiable breach in that regard. So it does all tie together. The more you have that under control, you can very quickly make an assessment to say yes or no, PII was involved in this particular breach, or if it was a basic ransomware attack and it's not notifiable, you still need to remediate it, and remediation may take longer than 72 hours if that was, it's part of that question there, but the distinction of is it notifiable, is there harm, is there PII, that can be done pretty quickly. Yeah.
Final call before we wrap up and have a drink.
For those who are not brave enough to put your hand up in public, you can come and have a chat with us over a drink and have some cheese and crackers that's sitting at the back there. But more than happy to hang around and have a chat. So.
Thank you, everyone.